Welcome to What Great Teachers Know That All Parents Can Use, a podcast where the classroom meets the kitchen table. I'm your host, Peyten Williams from Bow Bend Consulting, and I'm so glad you're here. As a parent, you're on the front lines of raising a child of character. It's a big job, and some days it's easy to wonder if you're getting it right. That's where we come in. This show is designed by teachers who've walked alongside hundreds of students, and we're here to be your guides. Each episode brings you practical wisdom from the classroom to help you lead with confidence at home, because your child's journey matters. And while every journey is different, you don't have to walk it alone. Today, you are going to be so inspired and equipped after our conversation with Rebecca Malotke Meslin, leadership coach and speaker and founder of Pleasantly Aggressive. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast. We're so glad you're here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Peyton.
Awesome. Well, Rebecca, you have a long history in education like I do. And so it's so fun to talk to educators who have taken what they've done in the classroom and actually transferred it into a new realm. And so just like this podcast does. So give us a little bit of how did you start in education and then where are you now?
Yeah. So actually, my educational background is in women's and gender studies and sociology. So I say that first because, like a lot of folks that work in schools, we sometimes stumble into certain positions at schools. I was a director of enrollment, admissions, financial aid, marketing, communications, and a little bit of DEI at 3 different independent schools over the course of about 15 years. One of my children has a 504 plan. So he has a 504 for ADHD. So I also have that perspective of what it's like to have a student and a child who is navigating some of those systems. 2 of the schools that I worked at were for students with learning challenges. So dyslexia, auditory processing, attention deficit. And then on the other end of the bell curve, I worked at a school for children who were gifted and talented. So super high achieving, twice exceptional in a lot of ways. So I have this really interesting perspective about like the education from a specialized standpoint and the needs of children. I have the personal perspective. And then now I've transitioned all of that into a business where I get to coach leaders. So after having spent a lot of time as a leader, I recognize that leaders in a lot of ways are struggling. This business really came out after COVID. And so that really, I think, exposed all of those raw nerves that educators and administrators were feeling. And I was seeing that they were worn so thin, they were really needing more external support in the form of coaching and professional development. And my specialty is women leaders. I really saw that there were not systems in place to support the women who were ascending into leadership roles. A lot of teachers moving into division head roles, a lot of support staff moving into middle management or director roles. And I wanted to be that person for them. I wanted to be that person that could help coach them through the tough times, but also build skills around leadership that maybe they were never taught. They're really smart folks, but they've never led a team of people, or they've never had to delegate. They've never had to hire or fire somebody. And all of that meant that I could really come in as an external third party and help teach them skills, but also just be that support person for them.
Rebecca, it's so fun for me to hear you talk about your journey because basically it's like she's done it all. Right? Like if you want to go to somebody who knows something about schools of any kind, you're going to be my go-to person. And I think what really struck me about your journey is that you know what it's like for people who are great people, who are smart, capable, wonderful people. And because they are that, they've been promoted into positions that they haven't been prepared for. And I actually kind of think parenting is a lot like that.
It's like 100%. Oh my gosh. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Peyton. That's a great analogy.
So I do think a lot of, just like so many things from teaching are transferable to parenting, a lot of things that you're talking about are also very transferable to parenting. When you think about the kind of skills that you're really working with teachers and with administrators, or if you think about kind of how that's transferable to parenting, what are some of the top things that are hot on your list?
This really broad category of communication, which encompasses everything, right? But I think sometimes we think of communication as the written word, right? How am I sending emails? How am I getting that message across? Phone calls, things like that. And yes, that's absolutely the kind of very tactical piece of it. But the vast majority of my conversations with my clients center around how to be effective in their communication, how to be empathetic in their communication. A lot of it is around these difficult types of conversations. How do I talk to my boss about something that's happening without getting overly emotional about it? How do I come in and talk about these are the struggles I'm having? This is where I need support, right? In the same way, they might need to talk to their direct reports. In the same way, they are having conversations with parents, right? I need to give this parent some news, and I'm so uncomfortable with this information. I know they're going to be uncomfortable, possibly upset, angry, sad, frustrated, right? So many emotions. And, the theme of that communication a lot of times is I don't have any control over how the other person responds and reacts or what they say. I only have control over what comes out of my mouth, what I say, when I say, how I say it. And so I spend a lot of time reinforcing that notion, but also we start to get into some tactical things about, how do I say it? I have so many clients that just say, do you have a script for this? Do you have like a template that I can use? And I feel like this has been one of the great gifts I've been able to give clients is I use a lot of different resources, and I'll say, yeah, let's start. This is a great script as a starting point. And let's talk about why we want to lay out a conversation like this, how we want to lay out an argument that usually comes into play when I'm helping people get raises. But, which is also important. I think as adults too, and you kind of hinted at this, like for parents, and I'm sure you get this, Peyten, people will come to me and say, just tell me what to do. just tell me what to do, right? They're really smart people who have tried using all of the resources that they have. And now they're at a point where they're like, I officially have exhausted the resources that I have, and I'm coming to you for help and support on how to figure out the next step. That's one of the great joys of my life, is being able to be that person for teachers, for administrators, right? For folks who are like, please just help me. Because when they get to that point, when they're willing to admit that they need help, I'm so glad I get to be there to support them.
Rebecca, so many things just are flying through my head right now, but the one that is really resonating with me is just the power of being an effective communicator as an adult when it comes to things like managing your emotions, knowing how you want a conversation to go ahead of time, having, like you said so wisely, the skills. Like there are things you can learn and practice. And so one of the things that I do, and I really think this just is exactly what you're describing, is I really work with teachers and parents to be the strong and kind adult in the room, right? It's like you want to be that firm person, but you also want to be kind, and you don't want to lose your bananas and win because you yelled at somebody, right? And so when you think about some of the hard conversations you're coaching, like deans and school leaders on, and teachers who want raises, that kind of stuff, those are hard conversations. What are some of the things that you coach them to do before the hard conversation even happens?
So I think that emotional regulation piece is one of the big ones. And it's in the moment is always going to be harder than right when you're sitting there and you have this beautiful script. But one of the things that I really, really focus in on is the preparation piece, the preparation and the practice. These are two different things. Practice is part of preparation, but when I think preparation, I think you're going into this conversation, and I'm going to pause and say, I'm looking at this through the lens of you are the one who is proactively having the conversation, right? It's not coming at you, so you get to prepare for it. Sometimes we don't get to prepare, right? Sometimes we just don't. But let's put our parenting hat on for a second. And I need to have a conversation with the teacher about something that's going on for my child. Writing out your script ahead of time is one of the most important things that you can do. And most people don't do it. We don't think we have the time. But the truth is, the amount of time you're spending running it through your head, if you just wrote it down. So writing it down is basically step one. And I'm a big fan of like stream of consciousness. Do not edit before it comes out of your brain. Just get it down on paper, because that's going to be your most authentic way that you would probably speak as well. Because step two is practicing it out loud. And what I always tell my clients is, if the first time it comes out of your mouth is in the meeting, it's like toothpaste in a tube. You can't put it back in. And you're going to be left feeling potentially regretful. You're going to be upset with yourself. And then that's going to trigger those emotional responses that you don't want, right? That you're trying to avoid or you're trying to mitigate. And so it's write it down and then practice it out loud. And what you'll find is that what comes out of your mouth when you're reading that, you need that auditory feedback for yourself to be like, what is this even? What do I sound like? There's a lot of conversation around like, is my tone right? And this is the thing that I think a lot of people like get stuck on is I don't want my tone to be wrong. I don't want somebody to assume that I'm being negative or that I'm being curt or that I'm being, list the things, right? And a lot of that might be a little bit of an activation of things that we've been criticized for in the past too, right? Being aggressive. Once you hear yourself, that's going to be your best bet. And practicing with somebody else, that's also a great idea, and if you're a parent and you have a partner who you can practice with, right, and have a conversation about, but it feels like a heavy lift. It feels like a lot of time. I guarantee you're spending that much time stressing, worrying, and rolling it around in your head. So get it on paper, practice it out loud, then make your edits for what you want to say, right? That's going to roll off much more naturally in the conversation, and you're going to feel more confident. That's really the key. Our emotional dysregulation a lot of time comes from not feeling prepared, but also getting in that moment and then maybe flubbing something. And then I start to get anxious and upset. And then the wheels come off the bus.
All I could think is I have some friends who are trying to talk to their kids about, drugs or sex or, friendships that they don't like. And as parents, what happens is we're in the car and our child says, oh, I heard so-and-so talking about blah, blah, blah on the playground today or at lunch. And we go, oh my gosh, I need to have this conversation right now. And we tube of toothpaste it, like you said, we way overgo because we're so emotional and it doesn't go well. Right. It never goes well. But I love what you said about like, let me get my thoughts together. What is my goal for this conversation? What do I really want to say? Let me get it down and then I'll get it right.
Yeah. And here's the thing. So oftentimes the goal we set for the conversation is about the other person. So I'll set a goal for a conversation that says, I want this person's behavior to change. I'm going to tell them all of this and their behavior is going to change. This is what we do as parents all the time, right? Like I'm going to have this amazing conversation with my child and their behavior is going to change. And then what happens? The behavior doesn't change. And then who feels like a failure? I feel like a failure, right? So instead, the goal of the conversation 9 times out of 10 is I want to get my message across clearly. Right? Be explicit. I want to share the relevant information. Maybe it's, I want to show up in listening mode. I want to be a deep listener in this conversation. I want to show up with curiosity in this conversation so that, again, at the end of the conversation, you're feeling like confident that I achieved my goals. I don't feel like a failure. You're putting it on yourself and what you can control, right? And then you're evaluating, okay, what are next steps and how might that person process? I give this presentation on difficult conversations to administrators. And I ask that question, like, what is your goal in the conversation? And 9 times out of 10, it's to change that other person's actions, to change their behavior. Like, that's what I want to happen. And I understand that is your long-term goal, right? I'm having these series of conversations to get to that point. And I'm talking about just the conversation, right? Just this one conversation, thinking deeply about what do I hope to achieve? What is my goal here?
And I think you make a great point that a lot of times hard conversations, whether you're a teacher, administrator, or parent, whether you're talking to another adult or you're talking to your child or a student, it's never going to be just one, right? Like all the data we know about talking to your kids about healthy behaviors, talking to your kids about this, it's not like we just one and done have one conversation and then it's magically, as you said, like, oh yeah, great. Knock that one off the list. I'm done. Right. I love what you just said that it's this conversation because we're going to have a couple more most likely, especially when we're talking about behavior change or mindset shift.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's before we prepare. Right. So then what are some of the things that tend to go wrong, right? I always laugh, like, what is that? The best laid plans of mice and men off Afghan Aglay is that, whatever poem. So what what are the things that while we plan, while we prepare, sometimes things go wrong? And what do you give people advice on how to help with that?
After preparation and before the conversation, there's one little sliver in there that I want to like highlight, which is avoiding the conversation. So
Oh,
sometimes that happens, right? So what can go wrong is that we are nervous, anxious, and so we put it off. And there's a great quote that I'm going to flub, but it's basically like, bad news is not like fine wine. It does not age well. Right. And so it makes it worse when you procrastinate, when you put things off. Now, sometimes we do this because we're like, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. But what I'll tell you is if you do the preparation, you're ready. Right. So like the hard part is like get into that prep mode when it's time. And then, right, we're going to move forward. So the first big thing I say is do not procrastinate. Do not put this off. This situation will not just improve on its own. But
yeah.
sometimes we really want to believe that it will. And this happens right in partnerships with our partners as adults. It happens with our children. This happens across the spectrum of our life. So remembering that procrastination is never going to be helpful. Avoiding is never going to be helpful. So that's one thing.
Do you have an example from life where you either have coached somebody who's been putting it off or you put it off at like when you were a teacher or administrator and you wish you didn't?
Oh my gosh, yes. Let me pick one of the many times that I have done that personally. I'm going to pull on an example of a time that I needed to have a conversation with my boss. So I wanted to go in and ask for a raise, and I kept putting it off. I kept putting it off. And I thought, oh, and in independent schools, we receive, and I think in public schools too, we receive our contracts, our renewal contracts, like around February timeframe. And I was like, well, I'll just get my contract and then I'll negotiate at that moment in time. And nobody had ever coached me around this. Nobody ever taught me any of this, right? I was kind of going in with like, I knew how to negotiate a little bit, but I didn't know the timeframes. And so when I got my contract and I said, okay, I'd really like to sit down with you and talk about this and talk about the potential for a raise. And they were like, oh, those conversations happen in October. Those conversations happened before we set the budget. Like those conversations happened a long time ago, but we'll consider it for next year, meaning like a year and a half from now. And I remember feeling this like an elephant was on my chest that I had because of my discomfort and also my lack of knowledge, but my discomfort had put it off. And the real consequence for me was cash money, baby. Like I was like, oh my gosh, now I have to wait all this time. And then I had to go home and have this conversation with my husband that I was so disappointed in myself. And of course he was supportive, but all of those feelings of regret, those are such powerful emotions, but I think they can be really useful to us in terms of if you're feeling like you're putting this off and you're couching it in like a little bit of discomfort or I'm not ready, if you can fast forward to, right, like to after the fact and say like, okay, it's the day of this conversation. How am I going to be feeling? Or after I have this conversation, how am I going to be feeling? Or what would again, I'm going to give my husband props here. Side note, I ran for office a few years ago. I ran for local city council. It was probably like 6 weeks out before the election. And I was feeling really stressed and anxious about everything and really worried about it. And he sat me down and said, okay, how many more weeks do we have? And I said, I think we have about 6 weeks. And he goes, okay, I want you to picture you wake up the day after the election and you've lost. And I was like, this is not what manifesting is, honey. I don't know what you're doing. And he said, no, I want you to picture that you lost. I want you to feel all of those emotions. I want you to feel what that feels like. And I was like instantly upset, right? I'm instantly like frustrated, upset, sad, really sad. And he goes, I want you to think about all the regret and what you wished you would have done. Now you have 6 weeks. Go do it.
How
I
motivating
know.
is
I don't know
that?
where that came from, but I was so happy because I think that moment of, and if we apply this to those difficult conversations, is to say, like, put yourself in that spot of, I had the conversation and what does it feel like afterwards? And let's say it doesn't go well. All right. So imagine that the conversation goes off the rails and it's terrible, right? I want you to ask yourself, what do you regret? And a lot of times it's just not preparing, right? Or it's my emotional regulation. You get to pinpoint, if you're good at putting yourself in that moment, you get to pinpoint what are those things, right? That I do have control over, that I can now reverse engineer, go back in time, because now we have a time machine because I imagine my future self. So that is, I think, a powerful exercise, especially for those really big conversations, right? Where there's a lot at stake.
I mean, I'm thinking about parents who are having conversations with their kids about things like this girlfriend or boyfriend of yours is a little bit not a great influence on you.
Yeah.
Or, no, you cannot have a phone. Or I'm worried you're doing drugs or smoking or drinking and it's not healthy or whatever it is,
Yeah.
right? Even from like little kids, I mean, that's a little less pressure on that. But then think about like older kids, right? You're not managing your finances well or you're gambling, all the hard conversations we have to
Oh
have
my
with
gosh.
kids. I love your idea of just like, if you put off that conversation, there's deep regret.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is like pretending like we have that time machine. And it can be that like that little motivating factor that we need to not put it off, but also come to terms with the parts of it that are hard for us so that we can manage it again before the toothpaste comes out of the tube.
I mean, there's so much good neuroscience too. I remember hearing some speakers say that if you imagine yourself doing it well, you're already better at it. Right. And then it's like, okay, if you imagine yourself not doing it well or it not going the way you want, and then you can, it's like you already lived it, then you can learn from that mistake before you made it. How beautiful is that?
Right.
Okay. So we've got before you prepare and practice, you don't put it off. You get your braveness on and you do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's next?
So next is clear is kind. To the point about the goal often being about the other person's change in behavior or what they're going to get out of the conversation. In that process, sometimes we say things in an effort to manipulate the other person's emotions. So we say things
What? I
because
never do that, Rebecca.
it's such a natural thing, right? Especially for the types of folks that we deal with, right? We're talking about parents. The content of these conversations is so emotional. These are our babies, right? We are already cognizant of how this might land for the other person, how this is going to feel for the other person. So what we start doing is our language gets really muddy. Even when we have our script, even when we know what we want to say, we start to read the other person's face. They start to well up in tears. They start to get angry, right? And all of a sudden we shift course. So the clear is kind piece is a couple of things. One is if I have prepared the script that is clear and I deliver it as such, and I don't allow myself to veer away in response to the other person. So it's, yes, read the room, right? We're not going to just drill somebody with information when they're sitting there crying in front of us. But the goal, right, is to be clear. So knowing that all of that flowery language, but it's going to be okay. And it's going to be fine, right? We throw those things in there, but I really love you. Recognizing that it makes it confusing for the other person. Whether you're talking to a parent as as a teacher, whether you're talking to your child. I think what most people shy away from with directness is the fact that they don't want to look mean. But if we subscribe to clear is kind, unclear is unkind, that means if you aren't being direct and clear in your communication, that is unkind to the other person. They don't know what to do with that information. They don't know how to move forward, right? And if we can shift our mindset around that, right, then suddenly I'm like, oh, that's being unempathetic. That's being unkind. I have to be clear. So that is one piece that I really, really drill home with my clients. I think the other piece is, if we shift into kind of like what happens after I've delivered something and there's engagement, right? So now the other person is responding to me. And this obviously comes up a lot with kids. It's going to come up a lot with parents. Is what I say is listen for the fear. So when somebody yells at you, their response is defensive, they're, crying, whatever their big emotions are, a lot of times it's rooted in some layer of fear, right? As a child, it might be, I'm not good enough. It might be, I can't do anything right, depending on what their emotional state is, right? It might be like, you don't think that I'm mature enough to handle this. But embedded in that is their fear of how this might fracture a relationship. For parents, it might be fear of my child's future, right? All of my fears show up, and sometimes they show up in unpleasant ways. Sometimes they show up as anger. So if you have just delivered some tough news, if you have just, had to have a difficult conversation and the other person reacts in a way that confuses you, or you now feel responsible for managing their emotions. Again, number one, it's not your job to manage their emotions. But number two is, how can we show up empathetically? We can listen for that fear and meet them at their humanity around that. When I'm thinking about coaching leaders, giving difficult feedback to an employee and they get upset, they might be thinking, I can't lose my job. I can't lose my health insurance. They're not angry at you. They're not coming at you. You're the messenger. So that also helps us separate ourselves. That's my next piece is you are two people having a conversation about a thing. Now, the thing might be a child. It might be about some behaviors of a child. It might be, right? Could be a lot of different things, but this isn't us versus them, right? It's not two people in opposition. So there's a little bit of trying to keep that objectivity of you and I are talking about this thing in between us. And that also kind of goes into that, like, how can I stay emotionally regulated? This isn't about me. Nobody's judging my parenting. We need to address the thing that's happening and make a plan.
I think what also strikes me is that fear is such a emotion that is prevalent in all sides of the conversation, right? You were mentioning earlier, we avoid the conversation because we're afraid. And I wonder, when you're coaching people on how to have these hard conversations, what is it about that emotional intelligence piece, right? Where you're like, clearly this requires a lot of emotional intelligence. Both you're reading yourself, your own fear, or your own anger or frustration or joy or hope or whatever it is, right?
Absolutely.
And then you're also reading the other person's. What advice do you give people about navigating those emotions in that moment?
I think emotional regulation, and I'm so glad this is like a term that's much more prevalently used, right, for adults as much as it is for children, because I know that it's just, I can name those feelings, right? Last night, I had to sit down with my son who's in the college process, right? He was avoiding having a couple of conversations around some prep work around, ACT and all of these sorts of things. And I told him, like, we're going to sit down after dinner. We're going to have this conversation. I'm prepping you for it. And he was trying to avoid it and get out of it, like teenagers might do. My husband's been doing a lot of that heavy lifting. He's been doing most of the conversations around college and scheduling visits and all that. My husband and I both work from home, which is a joy and a pleasure. And I'm not being sarcastic, because we get to have these conversations in the middle of the day, right? So I went into his office and I said, hey, I have to have this conversation with him tonight. And I just said, like, I know myself. And I know that when it comes to him, I can get dysregulated very quickly. I always have with him. We're very much the same person in a lot of ways. So I said, I'm just a little worried. And my husband said, do you want me to give you some advice? And I said, yes, please. But step one was me saying, like, I'm worried about my own regulation in this conversation. It's owning it. Now, not everybody has that self-awareness. What is the saying? Like, all feelings are valid, not all behaviors are, right? So just even that moment of going, like, yes, my emotions are valid, my feelings are valid, and like that doesn't mean I get to behave in a way. So my husband was like, okay, in our conversations, this is what I've been doing. I've come prepared. I've done this. And I was like, okay. I was still worried. Going into that conversation with my son last night that I was going to lose my stuff, right? When he wasn't responding in the way that I wanted him to. So first and foremost is owning your own emotions in that. The second piece is knowing when to walk away. Right. So I have a lot of clients who I think really fast on their feet, and they're able to respond quickly and respectfully in time. I also have clients who that is something they struggle with. Right. So in a high pressure, high emotional situation, their ability to process and come up with a response that they feel good about is really challenging for them. And honestly, for some people, that's always going to be a challenge. It might never be their strong suit. If that is the case for you or for someone else, right? The important thing is to recognize less is more. So being able to say, I need some more time to think about this. I need an exit strategy, but knowing that it's okay. Like, you don't have to have all the answers in the moment. You don't have to have like the most perfect response in that moment. And if you're feeling yourself becoming dysregulated, that's another thing you can prepare for. Then what is my exit strategy? If I don't have clarity, if I'm feeling upset, if I'm feeling like I'm going to try to pull it together as best I can, and knowing that I might need to say, I still have questions. Can we follow up? Can I come back to you? That's a really hard thing to ask in the moment. So preparing for and giving yourself permission to stop the conversation, to exit the conversation, but it is to have that self-awareness to say, I in my own brain at least, I don't feel regulated right now, and I'm afraid I'm going to say something I'm going to regret, or that I'm going to agree to something that I didn't actually agree to, that's okay. Give yourself that permission and think about what an exit strategy might look like for you.
That's so good. And it reminds me of something that I actually do sometimes with my own kids when I'm having a hard conversation with them is I'll say, "Hey, I have something I want to talk to you about, and I'm not sure how it's going to land with you. So I'm going to say what I want to say. And then I want to give us both a little bit of time to process because this might be emotional. So I'll give you some time to think about it, and maybe we can check back in a couple days or tomorrow."
I love
And
that.
especially if you're the one with the power in the relationship with which
Mm,
as a parent you always have that with a kid, it is such a show of respect because they're kids. They don't have that emotional regulation practiced like we do after 40 years. And some of us are still bad at it, myself included, right? So how can we expect a 5-year old or an 8-year old or a 10-year old or a 15-year old to be good at it? And I think that also holds true for adults, right? Like if you can know yourself and know, hey, I know this is going to be emotional for me, just tell them. I've had so many conversations where I've had great colleagues be like, hey, when you come in and observe me, this is when I was teaching, like when you come in and observe me, I'm probably going to cry afterwards. It has nothing to do with you. I'm just really emotional about what people watching me perform. And I was like, thank you so much. I'm not going to go give you all the feedback right after then. We're going to debrief 3 days later once you've had a chance to regulate. I feel like you named something so important of any parent or person who's having a hard conversation. One of the best ways to be empathetic and respectful and strong and kind, or pleasantly aggressive, as I love the name of your company, is that you acknowledge that emotions are going to be a part of it. We don't pretend like they're not.
100%. That is so beautifully said. And when I'm delivering, like if I have to sit down and deliver this big thing to you and my adrenaline is high because I've just now done the thing that I've been preparing for and practicing for, right? And I just delivered it to you. Sometimes when the other person sits there in silence for a moment, we are uncomfortable. And so we start to fill the void and we start asking questions or explaining more. And there it's just shut up. Shut up. Let the silence sit there because you're making it about you in that moment. And the conversation just shifted to the other person. And if you really want to be empathetic, which you just highlighted, again, I have no control over that person's emotions. What I can do is give them the space to process. You just handed them something really big and they need a moment. They need a moment to process. So if you really want to be empathetic, give them that time and space. And that might be, I can't talk about this right now. I need some time to think about it. Okay, let's reconvene. And then the second part is always, let's set up that time right now to meet. Because I don't want this to drag on. I don't want you to feel like I'm not paying attention to you. Right? Like, let's make sure we get to that next step. Letting that awkward silence exist is incredibly empathetic to the other person. It does not mean they're angry at you. It does not mean they're mad at you. It does not mean that they don't agree with you. We read into that silence so many things. We make so many assumptions about what that silence says instead of, I would rather you assume some good intent. I would rather you assume that that person is just trying to process what you just told them.
Well, and I think too, some people respond with silence, but some people in my family respond with defensiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they've perhaps been surprised by this news, or they knew it was coming, but they're angry that they're having to face it and they didn't have time to really prepare, or whatever it is, right? And so I think, to your point, allowing the silence, but also to some extent, and again, there's when you're a parent, there's that delicate balance between allowing your child to have emotions and then, like, I love what you said. It's like,
Yeah. All feelings are valid, not all behaviors are.
exactly, right? So if I talk to my child and they blow up, that anger is totally valid. And I also need to teach them that that behavior is not, right? And so that's a delicate balance, but you're not going to teach that lesson in that moment, right? And
Correct.
so I think that's an important piece too, because sometimes as a parent, we go from, oh, I'm going to deliver this really hard news for you. And then I'm also going to correct you about how you are responding in the moment.
Correct. Yes, we do that. And it's not helpful, right? Again, it's if our goal is to be effective in our communication, to be clear, we just kind of derail that by trying to do multiple things that we did not set out to do.
Right. So I love what you said earlier about it's like two people and there's this thing in the middle. Like keep your eye on the thing and then the other things that come up you can address, but like stick with that one thing in the beginning. That's such good advice that you gave. Is there anything that you think, gosh, we really haven't addressed this and I think it's important that, you know, this is something I know as a former educator and as a current person who works with educators and as a parent that parents need to know?
You know, there's this quote that I usually share, and I don't know who it's attributed to, but it doesn't get easier, but you get better. I think especially with difficult conversations, we want to believe that somewhere down the road, like this will just become easier. And I think that's analogous to parenting, right? Like there's no part of parenting that gets easier. You get better at it, right? You start to acquire skills and you have years of experience under your belt. I think that's important because if you are on a journey of wanting to be better at having difficult conversations, if you're wanting to be better at your just communication period, then your personal goal for yourself might be like, I have to recognize that some conversations are always going to be hard, but I can focus on the things that I can control and I can work to build this as a skill for myself so that, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, like I'm going to minimize all of those regrets after the conversation. I'm going to minimize those moments where I'm really hard on myself, or I'm really like feeling like a failure. I'm really feeling like I didn't handle that well. A lot of times difficult conversation for some of us in our careers, right? As a teacher, there's some consistency to it, whether that's parent teacher conferences or right. And as a parent, we know that it's just a part of parenting. And yet sometimes we're surprised by it. You know, we've all been sitting there one night going, God, I don't want to have this conversation about this texting situation with my child and this other kid in class, or about my child and this kid they're hanging out with. Like, I just don't want to have the conversation. And it's okay. Like, I think admitting that is really okay. Like, admit to yourself, like, this sucks. I don't want to do this, right? Like, I don't want to have this conversation again. Letting myself have a little pity party about it and then switching gears to say, how can I use this as not like an experience that I just trudge through, but instead, and maybe saying that it's a positive experience might be going a little far, but how can I make it an experience in which we both feel good at the end of it, that we both feel like we were respected in the conversation? And again, I can't take responsibility for the other person, but I can take responsibility for me. And your point about emotional intelligence is so well taken. That is a skill that we can hone. These are not inborn, right? These are not instinctual things. So for those that are listening and are feeling like, I got a lot of work to do, great. Just know that it's a journey and these are skills and you can build them and you can get better at it.
But for people who've been so inspired and really do want to get better and want to learn those skills, where can they find you?
So I live on LinkedIn. As a lot of people know, I spend a lot of time sharing thought leadership. I write a series called Dear Women Leaders, where I just speak to women leaders on LinkedIn and share insights and thoughts. A lot of it just comes directly from the conversations I'm having with my clients. I have that on LinkedIn. On my website, which is pleasantlyaggressive.com, super easy. I'm also have a blog. So there's a little bit longer form information that I share there. I want resources to be free and available to people so that they can just access them. If you're thinking about working with me or you know somebody who might be, on my website, you can just go there. There's a contact me form. My email address is there. Just click on it. And I'm on all the social media channels. It's just Pleasantly Aggressive. It makes life real easy. Oh, and I also have a podcast. So my podcast is Confidently You, Women in Leadership. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's sponsored by the Enrollment Management Association. I co-host it with my friend Lynn Macheski, and we talk to women leaders. We talk to women who are heads of school. We talk to women who are what we call school adjacent, so doing really amazing things in the school space. And they share their personal journeys through their career, but they're also giving good advice and talking about building relationships and what it's like to be a woman in leadership. And so I'll give a little plug for our podcast too.
I have a feeling lots of people are listening right now and heading straight to Pleasantly Aggressive because that's where I'm going to go next. Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. This was just a fruitful and helpful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad I got to share some of this with your listeners.
Well, y'all, I know you want more. You know where to find her. But that's it for this episode of What Great Teachers Know That All Parents Can Use. I'm Peyten Williams from Bowbend Consulting, signing off until next time. Thank you for sharing what you learn in this podcast with the people you love.